Hello, this is Dr. Brian Sloan from Adisale. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Dialing Down Heat Stress Mechanically and Nutritionally. It continues the Adisale Smart Science series that we started last year. This series is designed to advance our understanding of the role of the essential nutrient methionine. As the series continues, we'll learn more and more about how methionine impacts not only production, but health and reproduction. You'll find other webinars in the series at feedchannel.online. Heat stress is a perennial problem, and just as hot, humid weather wears us out, it takes a toll on dairy cows and their performance. As a company, we are continually being asked by nutritionists, should they change in any way how they dial in amino acid balancing and the provision of other essential nutrients during the times of the year when dairy cows are subject to heat stress. Research is beginning to provide new and greater insights into the impact of certain nutrients to mitigate the effects of heat stress on dairy cows' production and well-being. So with this new knowledge, fortunately, heat stress can be dialed down, as we say, both mechanically and nutritionally. And that's why we're delighted to present today's timely discussion by two well-known university experts. Dr. Bob Collier is the department head in the College of Agriculture and Life Science at the University of Idaho. He has an extensive background in this area and thoroughly knows the mechanics of mitigating heat stress. Bob is an outstanding choice to walk us through how to dial down heat stress via mechanical cooling. His expertise spans environmental and lactation physiology, endocrinology, and molecular biology. He has authored or co-authored numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, chapters, reviews, and abstracts, along with several industry articles, and holds several US patents. He has received numerous awards and honors from industry associations and groups, publications, and universities. Dr. Phil Cardozo is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Illinois. Phil is also extremely well known and listened to. Phil conducts research and provides very well received outreach programs in dairy nutrition and reproduction. His experience with dairy farms, both in Brazil, where he grew up, as well as in the US, give him a different perspective and set of management skills. Phil also has a veterinary perspective. He too is well published. Phil will guide us in how to dial down heat stress via nutrition. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Each of these experts will speak for 20 minutes. Then we will move into a 15-minute Q&A session. Along the way, please be sure to type in your questions for Bob and Phil. By getting your questions in during the presentations, you can ensure that they are in queue and ready for timely answers from our experts. Today's presentations are being recorded. We'll let you know when they are shared. They'll be posted on the website, www.feedchannel.online. And we'll even go one step further. We'll share all the questions and the respective answers on the same website, feedchannel.com. Watch for an email announcing their availability. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Bob Collier from the University of Idaho. Bob, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Brian. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. The electronic picture behind me is Palouse in the spring. And it is starting to look nice around here in Moscow, Idaho. But we know that warm weather is coming. And with warm weather, we get heat stress on dairy cows. So today we're going to be talking about dialing down heat stress mechanically. So I'm going to pull up my slides here and go to our slideshow. Stress is an external event resulting in strain on a biological system. That strain is measurable typically on the dairy farm as a decrease in feed intake or milk production. But if we could measure some of the physiological responses, we'd see increases in respiration rate, altered behavior, such as more time standing up. We know that if it's a true stress, it'll change maintenance requirements. So that increases the cost of maintaining the animal. And eventually it'll lead to increased adrenal axis activation and secretion of cortisol, and then subsequently reduced immune function. This is a pattern showing the seasonal changes in milk yield and milk protein yield over 12 months here in the U.S. And you'll notice that if we look at the blue milk protein line, it comes down, and the lowest point is July, August, which is when we have the highest temperatures. But the milk yield curve actually doesn't bottom out until September, October. The reason for this is the fact that the effect of heat on milk protein yield is direct. And so as soon as it starts cooling off, we have milk protein starting to come back up. But in the case of milk yield, we have two things going on. First, the direct effect of heat stress on milk yield. And then we also have the carryover effect of milk yield during late gestation on subsequent milk yield of the cow after calving. And so this seasonal pattern in milk yield is due to two things: the carryover effect from heat stress during pregnancy and the direct effect of heat stress, while the milk protein yield is primarily the direct effect of heat stress on milk protein synthesis. And we have looked at what kind of temperatures it takes to reduce milk production recently by Rosemary Burgos-Zimmelman using high-producing dairy cows, because the original THI chart used cows that average about 70 pounds a day. So these cows are producing over 100 pounds of milk a day or near it, and we see that they began declining in milk yield at a THI of 68, which is about 4 points lower. The original THI was 72. But as I said earlier, these are higher producing cows and therefore more sensitive to heat stress. And so you can see we have different levels of stress, from the stress threshold, mild to moderate, moderate to severe, and then severe stress. And all of these come with increasing reductions in milk yield and reproductive performance and reduced growth rate of calves. But we also have the impact on death rate, which a lot of people don't appreciate, but it doesn't take much of a change in THI to increase death rate in Holstein cows. This is a data set from Italy from Bernabucci and co-workers, over 1 million Holstein records. And we see that in a THI minimum of 70, so the lowest point, if it reaches 70, or if the highest THI reaches 80, you start to see massive increases in death rate. And if you look at a THI of 80 would correspond, if you look over here, be about 90 degrees with a 50% relative humidity. That would equate to increases in death rate, or if the minimum temperature, THI of only 70, which is a temperature of 76 degrees Fahrenheit with a 30% relative humidity. So death rate starts increasing relatively early on when heat stress begins to increase. And the cows that are dying are not the healthy cows. Most of these cows that are going to die during heat stress are going to be found in the sick barn. Those stresses are additive, and if you've got a cow that's already dealing with mastitis or metritis or metabolic disease, and you put heat stress on top of that, those are the cows that are likely to succumb to their combined stressors. But I often go into these sick barns or hospital barns, and very few of them have any cooling. And I've never understood why, because these cows, the sick cows, are the ones that need cooling the most, because they're the most stressed and the most likely to die if you have an increase in heat stress on the dairy. So remember to take a look at your sick barn and see if there aren't ways you can reduce heat stress on animals that are located in that facility. And I think you'll get a payback when you invest in some cooling there. This just shows, it's a table from Smith and coworkers, and it shows different levels of milk production lost per day, from 2 to 12 pounds a day lost milk for different periods of time during lactation, 90 days, 120, or 150. And you can see that that these losses, even small amounts of milk loss, 2 pounds or a kilo of milk a day, can over 150 days at $18 milk cost you $54 per cow, which if you've got a couple of thousand dairy cows, that's a lot of milk. And of course, at 10 pounds a day, you're talking really large amounts of loss in income. So cooling does have good returns on investment. And the question is how to go about that cooling. What are some of the mechanical things we can do? And before we do that, we need to talk about how cows lose heat. And on this schematic here, on the y-axis, we've got heat lost or produced. And over here on the x-axis is the ambient temperature around the animal, or the heat load. As you can see, the cooler it is, the more heat that is lost from the animal, and therefore more heat needs to be produced. And so as you look here at this lower and upper critical temperature, in between those two is called the thermal neutral zone, where the cow is not expending energy to heat or cool itself. But below this, cows must increase their heat production or energy. In other words, maintenance costs is increased to keep up with this heat loss. And of course, when you get into heat stress above the upper critical temperature, animals have to expend energy to dissipate heat. You also notice that the upper critical temperature is always below the body temperature. The reason for that is once the ambient temperature reaches body temperature, you cannot lose heat by conduction, convection, and radiation, which are 3 of the 4 routes of heat loss. And so actually when the ambient conditions rise above 101, or the body temperature of the cow, then that animal is going to start storing heat. And the only way for that animal to lose heat at this point is evaporative heat loss. And we all know that cows are not good sweaters. So this places cows in a precarious situation where they're producing tremendous amounts of heat, and their ability to lose that heat is greatly diminished or even reduced to zero. Excuse me. And so we have to find ways to alter the environment around the cow to make sure that she can still access these 3 major routes, conduction, convection, and radiation, in order to lose heat. Or we have to try to evaporate water for the cow by wetting it and evaporating water directly from its skin surface temperature. And so we'll look at some of these from a practical standpoint. And another thing that goes along with this, just point out that surface temperature, which is the skin temperature of an animal, is a very good indicator of what kind of state it's going to be, because from a heat loss standpoint, if the surface temperature of the animal is above 35 degrees centigrade, then that animal cannot lose heat by conduction, convection, or radiation. The reason for that is that the surface has to be cooler than the core of the cow for heat to flow down, to get out of the cow. And so if the surface warms up at or above the actual body temperature, it's going to start storing heat. And so here we can see that when the surface temperature or skin temperature of the cow stays below 35, we can keep that cow body temperature constant between around 38.5. Once it goes above it, then it's going to start storing heat, and you see heat stressed cows over here on the right, where their body temperature rises from 38.5 all the way up to 41.5. And of course, the skin temperature in these cows is around 40 degrees centigrade. So if you have a infrared gun, you can just walk around your animals and you don't have to touch them. You can do this from 10 feet away. Take the surface temperature of the animal, and if they're above 35 degrees centigrade skin temperature, they're going to need some additional cooling in order to maintain their body temperature. So strategies for reducing heat stress in dairy cows: we need to reduce heat gain by providing shade, reducing the air temperature, or reduce the skin temperature of the animal by evaporative cooling, wetting the cow and using wind speed to increase evaporation. We can reduce the air temperature by evaporating water directly into the air. And then, of course, providing shade prevents solar radiation from heating the skin surface. We can also help maximize heat loss by increasing wind speed around the animal, increase evaporation of water from the skin, and decreasing air temperature, which maintains those thermal gradients for the cow. And then we can finally reduce environmental variability by maintaining a constant environment in the barn using a cross-ventilated approach. Cross-ventilated barns have tremendous ability to minimize environmental variability, and this maximizes output, productive output of the animal. And in cross-ventilated dairy barns, you see a huge reduction in that seasonal pattern in milk yield. So the first requirement is always shade. It's the cheapest, and it's the first thing you have to do, because remember, the air temperature does not measure the solar radiation coming from sunlight. So if it's 90 degrees in the shade, which is the air temperature, then if there are animals standing in the sun, it's going to be more like 120 or 130 degrees, which is going to be very stressful. So cows always seek shade, and they'll move to follow the shadow, as you see here in this picture of the shade, which is oriented north-south. Now, if there was feed and water or fans or other cooling machinery in this structure, the cows would still follow the shadow. And so if you want to maximize cow behavior, you want to make sure that you orient your shade so that you've maintained the cows where you want them to eat and drink and to stay cool, because they'll walk away from cooling systems if that exposes them to sunlight. So always remember when you're building shade facilities, if you want the sun under the shade to dry out the floor, that's fine. Use a north-south orientation. But if you intend for the animals to stay under there, you'd better build it east-west, or you're going to be spending money on curtains to keep the shadow under the shade structure and the cows there as well. Now, if you look at the data, and this is from Rodriguez and coworkers in 2006, on whether animals prefer shade alone or misters alone, you might think that a mister might cool animals more than a shade, but you can see here the blue dots and line are cows that are under shade only, and they are considerably cooler during the hot part of the day than those cows that have no shade that are being sprinkled to cool their skin surface. So if you ever wonder what's the best investment, it's shade structures by far. And we have a variety of cooling systems. In this example, We've got a reverse chimney cooler. It's called a corral cool. It pulls air down through this cooling tunnel, and there are fans in here that increase wind speed and also nozzles to spray water. There's 12 different combinations of wind speed and water supply, and so these are very effective at cooling animals that are fixed. They don't rotate, and the animals need to stay under them. And so you'll notice that we have curtains here because this shade structure is oriented north-south, which come down to keep the cows under the shade. If those curtains didn't come down, these cows would still follow the shadow. But since they're under these coolers, you'll notice they're mostly lying down, and that's a good sign because heat-stressed cows usually are standing, and that's because they have to stand to pant. So another quick observation you can make in addition to skin temperature is see how many cows of yours in your facility are standing. And if there are a lot of cows or majority of them are standing, you can count respiration rates. And if the respiration rates of those cows are above 60 breaths per minute, which is half maximal, they're stressed. They're being heat stressed. This is another approach, and it's an oscillating system that also follows the shade. And so you can see these systems are blowing air, and these are not fixed, they're rotating, oscillating back and forth. And when the shadow moves, they have solar detectors on the cooling system, so they'll rotate and blow the cool air out where the cows are. Now, so this has advantages that you have the ability to cool the cows where the shadow is located if it moves. And second, the other thing about it is because it's rotating, it doesn't stay fixed over a single animal for the entire cooling cycle. And so in extremely hot weather, this approach of an oscillating system doesn't cool quite as much as a fixed system where the cow's under the cooling stream constantly. And this just shows, this was in southern Arizona. You can see that the oscillating fan and the corral cool system shown in yellow and red. And you notice that the corral cool system is slightly better than the oscillating system until the monsoon begins. And here you see the moisture coming up when we have our monsoon rains. Now we have high temperature and high humidity, and the corral cool system loses its advantage, so there's no difference during hot, humid weather between the two systems. And obviously, because it's now humid as well, milk yield also declines more during this period. Another approach is using conductive cooling. And an original approach is just cooling ponds, which are found in Florida and some southern states. The disadvantage is that you have contamination of the water, so you can't use a moving water source that's going to be going outside of the dairy. It's got to be fixed and the water contained on the dairy. But it's a very effective way of cooling, and as you'll notice, mainly cools the bottom 1/3 of the animal. About 20% of the animal gets cooled by this approach, but it's a fairly effective way to move heat out of the animal. We've done research on cooling pads for cows to lie on, which would be a very similar, and they do increase heat loss, but there are not any commercially available systems now, or as of yet, that have been shown to be cost effective. And finally, I mentioned that maximum environmental cooling is through use of cross-ventilated barns. Here you can show the exhaust here, and then the intake, water is pulled through these pads that have water coming down across the pad to evaporate. So you effectively cool the air inside of these facilities, and then during the winter, it reduces heat stress. So they've been very effectively used in the Texas Panhandle and the upper Midwest to protect against both heat and cold stress. And because they reduce that environmental variation, they have very little seasonal pattern in production, and the animals have higher milk yield across the year. And as you'll notice, these are very large structures, so big capital investments. And it really depends on the milk price and whether the number of animals you can get into a facility, whether you can cash flow the cost of doing this. But certainly it has been demonstrated to be cost effective in a variety of locations, including Florida. So just looking at this overall, we want to protect animals with shade first. That's the least cost approach. Next, we want to increase wind speed with fans, and if we need to drop the air temperature, we can blow or water into that airstream to reduce the air temperature, increase convection, or we can cool the animal directly with water and then evaporate the water off the animal. Shade gets rid of that direct solar radiation. There may be some infrared heat that comes down on the animal from the shade metal structure, but this can be effectively reduced with insulation. And finally, there's an opportunity to use conductive cooling of bedding material to improve heat loss of animals to the bedding material. And studies have shown that sand is a very effective bedding material for this use. And dried manure, not so much, because dried manure holds water and water holds heat, and therefore it's more difficult to cool using dried manure than it is sand bedding. So we want to reduce heat load with shades, increase heat loss by increasing wind speed, lower skin temperature by wetting cows directly and evaporating the moisture with fans, lower ambient temperature by evaporating water sprayed into a fan, and then increase conductive heat loss through cooled water beds if available. And these have all been shown to be effective, and the effectiveness really depends on the location and the environmental conditions the animals are facing. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Bob, for that excellent presentation. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to have you with us today. You gave us many great take-home messages, and I know that you're waiting till after the next presentation to help answer some questions. Just want to remind the audience that please start posting your questions so that we can make sure we have some good questions to ask both speakers after the next presentation. So next up is Dr. Phil Cardozo from the University of Illinois, who will share insights and research to help guide us in mitigating heat stress through nutrition. Phil, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Edicel for inviting me to be part of the Smart Science Series webinar. I feel very honored to be here, and it's a pleasure for me to talk about this topic, that it's some nutritional strategies to alleviate heat stress. Of all those nutrients out there, if I had to focus a little bit and throughout the literature, we can find some of these nutrients associated with heat abatement. We can find a pretty good amount of literature on how they would impact or how they would help with heat abatement, right? All those nutrients. But today I would like to focus on minerals and protein as well, that we have done some research that I would like to share with you here today, right? Like I said, that evaporation, if you ever wonder why our sweat is salty, there is something related to eliminating some of those minerals through sweat or evaporation, especially CO2 through cows, what can lead to also some reduced rumen pH and potential for ruminosidosis. And there's some research out there, and that's what I show you here, the rumination in minutes per cows. And you can see the high yielding cows, as they start experience higher THI, what happens is that rumination drops dramatically, right? So there is an impact of the environment on rumination, or at least here measured by minutes of rumination per day. And that can lead to another source of problems, like, for example, the acid-base balance in cows, right? And if you look into the NRC, right, our recommendations for these minerals in 89 and then updated in 2001, most likely we're going to get a new one in 2021. Let's see how it goes. But we always had here in Illinois our recommendation, and it would say, hey, you know what, during the summer, we've experienced that increase in magnesium, sodium, potassium on those diets have added some benefits. And based in what? So that goes back to evaporation and some of those minerals that are being lost through the summer through heat stress, but also through some kind of older research that we can look here. If we look into this response surface graphs on dry matter intake, sodium and potassium specifically here, right? So we can see that in the winter, as we add more potassium or we add more sodium, there is a limit. So, or in other words, there is a peak where you have maximum dry matter intake for those minerals. So if I add too much sodium, at some point cows are going to stop eating. And the same thing would be with potassium. However, when they did the same aspect of that research, the same response surface, but now they did that in the summer, what they realized that is that as they increased potassium, that intake never stopped increasing, right? That was not the same with sodium. Sodium is still good to control and not feed too much. Otherwise, you're going to have reduction in dry matter intake. You still have a peak to that 0.4, 0.30. However, potassium, there is this indication of, hey, feeding more potassium in the summer may be beneficial for intake. And then, of course, you can relate that to milk yield and everything else, right? And cow's health. And maybe we are going to, if we look into potassium, sodium, they're all positively charged ions, and comes back to that DCAT idea that it's very popular during prepartum, during the negative DCAT, right? But what we want to talk now, it's about lactating cows and them being positive. Is that any effect of adding more positive or the cat ions in that diet, like potassium, for example, would that be beneficial? It seems to maximize feed intake at that concentration between 250 and 400 when they put the data together, improve milk yield and dry matter intake of those cows, and it could be useful in heat stress conditions, right? Because of that increase in those minerals. And then when I pick some of those graphs and I plot here for you, you can see that dry matter intake, milk yield, milk fat, even though linear, and right, there is like an optimal range where we should be, right? So I think increasing those minerals during the summer, during a heat stress moment, I think it's important, and I think it corroborates with this meta-analysis showing, hey, we may not be feeding enough cations or a positive DCAT to those cows, especially in the summer, but this would be worth this data for the whole time, right? Summer or winter. So that cow in heat stress, there is that fire, but there is also that fire that comes from her, right? And there's a very nice review. I really suggest you guys to go ahead and read it from Bear Bradford in 2015, where he's talking about this fire, the flame that is inside the cow. And actually, he talks about some of those responsible for the flame to being heat stress and also oxidative stress, right? Through this reactive oxygen species, or ROS, right? And through heat shock proteins through heat stress, right? So he focused a lot on the inflammation. And actually there is data, research showing that, yeah, heat stress increases the amount of those reactive oxygen species, ROS, and I'm showing you here some of them, this peroxide, superoxide, or hydrogen peroxide, I think are the most common ones when we talk about it. And also, similar to oxidative stress, because of some of the genes that are expressed during heat stress are very similar to the ones when we have oxidative stress, right? So there's a comparison there. But how that look inside the tissue of the cow? So you have ferritin there is responsible for storing iron, right? Very important. And we know that during heat stress, that ferritin now starts releasing some of that iron in a form that we call now transition mineral ions, and I'm going to refer here to TMI. So you have the increase of this TMI that now you have ferrous instead of ferric. There are also other minerals that are encompassed to this TMI, right, this transition mineral ions, but they are also then going to create some of those peroxides. And also they can damage the DNA of the cells inside the liver, so the hepatocytes, right? And what happens? What are the mechanisms that the cow has to prevent that? One of the things is two main enzymes, that is the antioxidants. So remember, you have the ROS in one part of the scale in the previous slide, and then you have the antioxidants. So that's where we need to bring the balance, right? So glutathione peroxidase, right? And again, that's where I bring the point of nutrition, and I bring selenium is being extremely important on this antioxidant system here, is that selenium is going to be part of this glutathione peroxidase enzyme, and this enzyme is the one that is going to be able to first deal with this TMI, this minerals, and excrete them in a chelated form, but also it's going to act directly to hydrogen peroxidase, or in the case of the oxides, that's going to be more the styrodyl oxidase dismutase that also depends on some trace minerals, or SOD for short. They are going to be able to chelate or to oxidize this, transform to water, and then alleviate the cows or the impact of heat stress in the cow. However, when you have a elevate or a continuous heat stress, then what you're going to have is too much of those compounds, and you're going to have a lack of those components or those antioxidants to deal with the cow. So imagine if cows are deficient or they don't have a good source of selenium or trace minerals, what's going to happen is that that enzyme now is going to be deficient, and that is going to be an impact in the liver. And that impact was measured throughout different research trials. And there's DNA damage, heat shock proteins, but there is some cell death that is happening, especially at the level of the liver, right? What could that mean in response from the cow? Well, this very interesting research by Gal and others in 2017, right? What they saw is that when they have cows during a period without heat stress, right? This is the protein yield that the cows are producing. So it's pretty normal protein yield coming out of them. And then whenever they induce those cows in heat stress, the protein yields drop dramatically. And the other group of cows that they call the par-fed thermoneutral, what they did was they fed the cows the same amount that was reduced from the intake of the heat stress cows. So the heat stress cows dropped the intake, they dropped the offered dry matter for the cows in the par-fed group. That's why it's par-fed to the heat stress cows. So we take out the intake confounding from that question on the impact of heat stress. So they didn't drop as much, right? So meaning there is something that is not being as efficient in the heat stress cows on how to partition those nutrients. They realized that MUN, mucourea nitrogen, was higher on those cows. So again, alluding to some inefficient in nitrogen utilization that could be leading to lower protein yield, right? Milk drop as well. And when they did the analysis in blood or plasma, again, BUN correlated pretty well with what happened in the MUN, mucourea nitrogen, right? But they showed something, a tendency for glucose to be lower in the heat stress cows. That means that the cows are preferring to use glucose than NIFA, for example. When cows reduce the intake on the pair-fed group, NIFA goes up, meaning these cows are a little bit starving. However, during heat stress, this doesn't happen, right? They prefer to use glucose than to use NIFA. And something very related to protein yield now, they show that total amino acids in plasma was reduced in cows in heat stress, right? Remember, they ate the same thing as the par-fed, but something was happening that they didn't have enough total amino acids circulating in the blood. Is that showed elsewhere? Well, here what I want to show you now, going from what that research showed, right, with the decrease in protein yield, and I want to share with you from the last 6 or 7 years, last 6 years, the protein yield in the bulk tank of our farm here at the University of Illinois. And as you can see, that's a line that is going up. Luckily, right, we get paid by protein yield, for example, so it's good for us. We're making more money, but you can see it's not a straight line, and you have some dips, some valleys, and you have some peaks there, right? And you're right, that's summer, right? So the summer, especially in our old facilities, when you have a farm that is from the 30s or 40s, we have a limited amount of resources on how to work with heat abatement. So we do see a reduction of those milk protein whenever we have the summer. But interesting enough, one of the things that we've been doing since 2015, roughly, is to start formulating for amino acids. So rumen-protected methionine, rumen-protected lysine, right? Well, I don't see any difference. Well, we also collect information from the farms on our route. So there are 30 farms around us that the same truck is collecting. So they give me the data as well. And you can see that they also have the impact of summer. However, you can see now that, especially after we started to formulate for amino acids, this blue line started to detach from the orange line. That means we are getting more protein in the bulk tank than those other farms. And when I compare to all the farms that are sending to the same factory, prairie farms, then you can see that very similar to our route, but is still below our number. So again, from the perspective, we start seeing that, well, we start feeding for amino acids, our bulk tank, our protein from our cows, milk yield, protein is not suffering as much as the other ones. We do have problems in the summer, but even though we seem to have a better result than other farms. Could that be amino acid formulation? Well, that's something that we want to explore there, right? Here is Russell Pate, my former PhD student, did an awesome job in this paper. Again, I'm going to highlight some of the outcomes of this experiment, but all these papers that I'm talking about, I'm glad to share with you guys. So this is the paper. So we have this baseline for 9 days, and then you have this phased trial where we're collecting some of those samples. And we collect a bunch of data to make sure the cows are in heat stress or try to decide at which level. And then we are collecting a lot of samples that I'm going to share with you some here, right? But one thing that we wanted to do is to talk about the difference, right? So show how different was phase 1 to phase 2. So we did a pair analysis. So how does that mean? Well, we get, for example, an average for what the cow did on that first phase, and then we compare how it was different when we did the heat stress or the par-fed thermoneutral, right? So for example, if on average the cow was producing 30 kilos of milk on that first phase, and then she produced 30, 25, and 20, those were the values. So the value was -5, 0, or -10. Okay, so that to highlight the difference. I'm not so much worried about the absolute number in this case, right? So just want to share with you the diet that was the ingredients, the chemical analysis of that diet. It came out at 15% crude protein, nothing very special, pretty common here in our area in the Midwest, very corn silage based diet. And here more specifics on the amino acid nutrition, some of the numbers, we can talk more about it. Well, what we can see here is that we had seeders with buttons that could measure the temperature of the cow through the vagina. You can see, yes, cows in heat stress, they had increased vaginal temperature and also increased rectal temperature. So there was a difference of core temperature of those cows, saying to us that, yeah, your method worked, you induce heat stress. The other thing is the respiration rate. Like I showed in that first video, you can see another video here. Yes, the respiration rate went up and heart rate went up as well with the environmental treatments, right? Dry matter intake, they dropped pretty similarly, even though you can catch statistically, but if you see numbers, that's minimal. That was the same thing that others found in the past. And for us here, one that was different was that we saw this different by environment where milk yield was higher for the cows in the heat stress than it was, or the difference was lower. So we're talking here about 2 kilos of milk perhaps. And then there are some discussions that we do on this and how different we did comparison to other trials. Milk protein, that's where we start seeing some very interesting results. As expected, in heat stress, cows reduce the milk percentage, and cows under the rumen protected methionine reduce it less, right? So saying that, hey, if you feed that amino acid more, saying that if you feed that most limiting amino acid, in this case methionine, you may maintain that protein yield. And also then the same thing happened with casein, right? So part of that milk protein, 80% roughly, 78 to 82% is made of casein, and that's actually what's going to originate cheese, right? So when we see cheese yield, cows that received protected methionine, they would yield more cheese. I don't have it specifically which casein it is, but total casein, that's what we were able to measure here. When looking to the milk fat, we saw that rumen protected methionine increased the amount of fat in milk under heat stress compared to control. And when we analyze what type of fatty acids was there, there was no difference between rumen protected methionine and control, but between par fat and heat stress, you can see that cows under heat stress, they have a decrease in the amount of de novo versus the par fat. Again, talking about the utilization of fuel from NIFA versus glucose, like I've mentioned before. And when we look into the mammary gland, we got the biopsies, and through immunohistochemistry, we are able to see tunnel cells and KY67 that are pretty much the alveoli, they are dying, or the alveoli in that mammary gland, they are proliferating. And we can do a relationship or a ratio between them, right? And what we can see is that when we see the apoptotic cells, you have this relationship where in the summer, it seems like control had more of those cells. And when we do the ratio, the same story, more cells dying than cells proliferating, saying that perhaps methionine as an essential amino acid had the capacity to protect or induce some of those cells not to die, not to go under apoptosis, and perhaps to have more secretory cells. What would be my take-home message here? I think there's no magic pill as the nutrient that is going to avoid heat stress or prevent heat stress in dairy cows. I think the ones that we talked today, especially increasing the DCAD, selenium through glutathione peroxidase, methionine, have been proven to improve the cow's ability to maintain homeostasis or recover, right? I do think that heat stress abatement mechanically can be achieved in a more efficient way, but we should never disconsider all the nutritional aspects as well. With that, I'd like to say thank you again for making me part of this the webinar series.